Peggy, not in front of the BOY.
I need both of you to sign this permission slip.
All righty. What's it for, son? Contact football? No, you're not old enough for that. Ringworm test? What? Sexual education?
Don't have sex, because you will get pregnant and die. Don't have sex in the missionary position. Don't have sex standing up. Just don't do it. Promise?
My mommy and daddy did that?
Actually, a very beautiful thing.
I think it should be outlawed.
So your body's changing. Believe me, I know how that feels. Hi, I'm Captain America. If you're watching this video, your parents have elected for you not to be present in the health class for a discussion of human reproduction.
Do you remember what sex ed was like growing up? Did you mainly learn from friends or from sneak peeks of porn on the internet? Did your parents give you the talk? And was that a thorough discussion or more beating around the bush? Was your prior knowledge about sex corroborated in school? I'm asking all this because we're going to talk about sex education. What is it? Where did it come from? And where did we go wrong? From the social hygiene movement to today's fights over inclusivity, the history of sex ed in the US is full of controversy and contradiction. In this video, I'll talk about the roots of these tensions and the evidence behind what actually works. Let's unpack the forces that have shaped sex ed as we know it and explore which approaches actually serve young people best. One of the first implementations of sex education in the United States was in 1913, when the Chicago Public School District superintendent named Ella Flagg Young became the first in the country to implement formal sex education programming. She hosted a series of lectures called Personal Purity Talks, and although these talks would be considered quite conservative by today's standards, many parents and educators were furious, and the school board decided to rescind its permission for Young to hold such lectures. The American Social Hygiene Association was established in 1914 and was one of the earliest advocates for sexual education programs. The social hygiene movement strived to combat the rise in sex work and prevalence of venereal disease in the early 20th century. Social hygienists felt that teaching people about the dangers of promiscuous behavior in premarital sex would solve the issues of prostitution and sexually transmitted infection. You'd be surprised to learn how much the US military impacted sex education after World Wars I and II. Sexually transmitted infections like syphilis and gonorrhea were seen as serious threats to military readiness, with infected soldiers posing a health crisis that could sideline troops and undermine operations. As a result, the US military invested heavily in public health campaigns that combined medical treatment with education about prevention and the promotion of abstinence. After the war, many who had worked in military settings began advocating for sex education in civilian life as a matter of national health and responsibility. And the US government began funding sexually transmitted infection prevention programs, which caused a positive shift in the public's perception of sex ed. Dr. Mary Calderon was the medical director for Planned Parenthood, and in 1964, she founded the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, also known as SIECUS, out of her concern that young people and adults lacked accurate scientific information about sex. In the early days of SIECUS, they published study guides on sex education, masturbation, and homosexuality, many of which were used in public schools.
What is this film really saying? First of all, that sex is normally and properly a part of each one of us from babyhood on. Secondly, that understanding and acceptance of the normal sexuality of children of all ages is a must for every adult. Most of all, children need parents who can show love for each other and for their children. For in such a home, sharing knowledge of this great and universal human experience can only serve to strengthen family ties.
Talking about sex like this so plainly and openly was a revolutionary act at this time, and it was certainly met with its fair share of criticism and contempt. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. In 1969, a 40-page pamphlet titled, "Is the Schoolhouse the Proper Place to Teach Raw Sex?" was published by the John Birch Society, an American right-wing political advocacy group. The author, Gordon Drake, opened the book by saying, "Dr. Calderon is on a burning mission to alert and convert the youth of America to a new sexuality. She pursues children and youth for her cause as ardently as the missionary of old pursued souls." Drake and his pamphlet garnered national attention, as did his many unfounded claims of what was going on in classrooms across the country. He told stories of condom demonstrations on large, lifelike phalluses and co-ed bathrooms with no partitions as a way to desensitize youth to the opposite sex. These tall tales had no basis in truth and did not accurately represent the sex education that SIECUS was supporting. By the 70s, most people acknowledged that the country had undergone a sexual revolution. The traditional view of premarital sex shifted to a greater acceptance, and the invention of the birth control pill had given women control of their own fertility in a way they never had before. Supreme Court decisions had legalized abortion and made birth control more readily available, and this reproductive freedom gave women the ability to plan families and invest in their careers, and changed the way many in society viewed premarital sex, relationships, and even marriage itself. With this, public opinion on sexual topics changed rapidly in just a few years. In a 1969 poll done by Cornell University, they found that 70% of Americans were opposed to premarital sex, but by 1973, that percentage shrunk to 49%. Beginning in the 80s, the conversation about sex ed in the United States began diverging in two pretty different directions. A debate between a more comprehensive approach to sex education, which provided information about sexual health, including information about contraception, and abstinence-only programs, which teach abstinence from sexual activity outside of marriage as the sole and most effective method of preventing pregnancy and sexually transmitted infection, and also specifically excluded information about contraception. Comprehensive sex education was based on the belief that medically accurate and comprehensive information about sexual health would decrease risk-taking behaviors among young people, while abstinence-only education was based on the belief that this medically accurate, comprehensive information would actually increase risk-taking behaviors. Nowadays, there is significant scientific evidence that a comprehensive approach to sex ed promotes sexual health among young people by reducing sexual risk-taking behavior, while the abstinence-only approach has not shown such results. In 1981, U.S. Congress passed the Adolescent and Family Life Act. This was a federal law that provided federal funding to public and private nonprofit organizations that taught adolescents to abstain from sex until marriage. This act received several criticisms because it directly benefited abstinence-only education programs from religious organizations. Later in 1988, the ACLU challenged the Adolescent Family Life Act in the Supreme Court, calling it a, quote, Trojan horse that smuggled the doctrines of the Christian right to public school children at public expense and in violation of the principle of separation of church and state. Although a lower court had agreed with the ruling that this act was unconstitutional, the Supreme Court disagreed and they settled the case out of court. However, 12 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court held that federally funded programs must remove direct references to religion. Such programs could no longer tell students to leave room for Jesus or bring Jesus on your date as a chaperone. They were also no longer allowed to have these programs take place in churches or at religious schools during the school day. Any discussion of sex education in America has to include the profound impact of the AIDS crisis. The emergence of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s served as a pivotal moment for sex education. Previously, topics of homosexuality and non-reproductive sexual acts were considered completely taboo and even forbidden. However, the urgent need to address the spread of HIV/AIDS prompted a shift towards a more comprehensive and explicit instruction. In 1986, Surgeon General C. Everett Koop advocated for sex education, recommending that it begin as early as the 3rd grade. In a 1986 Time magazine cover story, Koop is quoted as saying, "There is now no doubt that we need sex education in schools, and that it must include information on heterosexual and homosexual relationships. We have to be as explicit as necessary to get this message across. You can't talk of the dangers of snake poisoning and not mention snakes." Later, in 1996, Congress attached a provision to welfare legislation that established a federal program to exclusively fund abstinence-only programs. Title V of the Social Security Act defines abstinence education using 8 very particular guidelines. And if educational programs wanted to maintain their federal funding, they had to abide by each one of these. As comprehensive and abstinence-only sex education became more and more polarized, many research studies and polls were conducted in the 2000s to try and measure the effectiveness of these programs. As comprehensive and abstinence-only sex education became more and more polarized, many research studies and polls were conducted in the 2000s to try and measure the effectiveness of these programs. In December 2004, Representative Henry Waxman released a report on 13 abstinence-only programs. This report found that these programs were often inaccurate, dishonest, and containing information that directly contradicted the findings of government agencies such as the CDC. 11 of these 13 curricula contained errors and distortions. These 11 programs grossly underestimated the effectiveness of condoms and other contraceptives in preventing pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. They made false claims about the physical and psychological risks of abortion. They offered misinformation on the incidence and transmission of STIs. They replaced scientific facts with religious views and moral judgments. And they distorted medical evidence and basic scientific facts. The highest amount of federal funding for abstinence-only education was in 2006, with grants surpassing $176 million. In 2007, an academic named Christopher Trenholm published a study evaluating 4 Title V abstinence-only education programs. His evaluations, based on data collected from teens 4 to 6 years after study enrollment, found that all 4 programs were ineffective in helping young people change their behavior. No program helped teens abstain from sex any longer than other teens. No program helped raise the age of first intercourse, and no program helped reduce the number of teen sexual partners. Teens in abstinence-only programs were also found to believe that condoms reduced the risk of sexually transmitted infections at a much lower rate than other teens. Shortly after this study, nearly half of all states decided against applying for abstinence-only educational funding due to its curricular restrictions and the requirement that states contribute matching funds. These and numerous other studies showed that the increased dominance of abstinence-only education programs in the 90s and 2000s left an increasing proportion of teenagers without formal instruction about birth control. As we've learned, decisions are made at the state and local level about which sex education programs are offered in which schools. But the federal government influences programs in local schools and communities by offering financial support for school-based efforts. This is how the Obama administration and Congress ushered in a new era of sex education in the U.S. through the Appropriations Act of 2010 and federal healthcare legislation, which eliminated 2/3 of federal funding for abstinence-only programs and provided nearly $190 million in funds for evidence-based, comprehensive teen pregnancy prevention programs. These programs permitted discussion of birth control on a federal level for the first time. Even with this progress made under the Obama administration, abstinence-only programs did not disappear. In 2010, the Title V funding stream was revived through the Affordable Care Act. The following year, Congress introduced a new funding source, the Community Abstinence Education Grant Program. However, supporters of abstinence-only education recognized they no longer had the same level of support from lawmakers or parents. So they began using different language to promote the same ideas. In 2012, the National Abstinence Education Association renamed itself as Ascend. The group claimed teens needed, quote, skills, information, and encouragement to avoid all sexual activity, hopefully until they marry. Rather than using the term abstinence only, they began calling their programs sexual risk avoidance programs. Ascend also started presenting its message as a solution to poverty. They promoted a theory called success sequencing, which suggested that people who finish high school, get a job, and wait until marriage and after the age of 21 to have children are less likely to live in poverty. According to this theory, avoiding sex before marriage was essential to building a successful life. But this idea ignores the impact of institutional racism and socioeconomic status. It inaccurately assumes that all young people have equal access to opportunity, when in reality, later research showed success sequencing usually only works for white people. Other studies found that only graduating and getting a job mattered in terms of future poverty, not whether someone had sex as a teen. Despite this theory gained traction with conservative lawmakers. The Community Abstinence Education Program was renamed the Sexual Risk Avoidance Education Program and adopted the same language used by Ascend. Now that we've looked at how sex education in the U.S. has evolved, especially the push and pull of different policy decisions surrounding abstinence-only and comprehensive sex education, we're left with one big question: what actually works? According to the Guttmacher Institute, teen pregnancy rates in the U.S. dropped significantly from 1990 to 2011. Abstinence-only proponents want to claim victory, but the data shows that comprehensive sex education, access, affordability, and use of effective birth control, access to safe and affordable abortion, and an increase in delayed sexual activity in teens ages 15 to 19 years old are the top reasons for this. In multiple research studies, abstinence-only programs were not significantly associated with a risk reduction for teen pregnancy when compared with no sex education. When compared with comprehensive sex education, the latter was associated with a 50% lower risk of teen pregnancy. I also think it's important to look at the opinions of parents. 3 decades of national polling has shown that the vast majority of American parents have long supported comprehensive and medically accurate sexuality education. Over 95% of U.S. parents believe that sex education programs in high school should cover topics such as sexually transmitted infections, HIV, healthy relationships, birth control, and abstinence. 90% of parents believe that these sex education programs should be in middle schools and also cover the same topics. But despite these findings, the United States still ranks highest for teen birth rates among westernized countries. This is due mainly to the lack of required sexual health curricula in U.S. schools, as well as the continued teaching of false and misinformation provided in abstinence-only programs. As of April 2025, 36 states require the provision of sex education, and out of those states, only 26 require that education to be medically accurate. And finally, only 11 states require instruction on consent and how to say no. Although misinformation has always been a part of public discourse, recent years have seen an alarming rise in false and misleading claims about human anatomy, sexuality, and gender identity, especially in political platforms and policy proposals. A clear example of this is Project 2025, a sweeping plan put forth by the Conservative Heritage Foundation, which outlines how a certain future administration could roll back LGBTQ+ rights, restrict comprehensive sex education, and reshape federal agencies to reflect a narrow, ideologically driven view of gender and sexuality. Another example is the proposed executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. This order falsely frames inclusive sex education and gender-affirming care as threats to women's rights and public safety. It uses scientifically inaccurate language to promote a rigid, binary understanding of sex and gender, ignoring decades of medical and psychological research affirming the diversity of human identity and biology. At the same time, funding and policy decisions at both state and federal levels continue to directly impact what kind of sex education students receive. Some states have advanced, inclusive, and medically accurate curricula that address topics like consent, identity, and healthy relationships. Others have moved in the opposite direction, passing laws that ban discussions of gender identity, restrict the mention of LGBTQ+ people, or require parental opt-in for even the most basic of sex ed instruction. The result is a deeply uneven educational landscape, where a person's access to accurate sexual health information just depends on where they live. But maybe where they live doesn't matter anymore, because as of April 3rd, 2025, the Trump administration has launched an investigation into California's Personal Responsibility Education Program to assess its medical accuracy, specifically focusing on its LGBTQ+ content. The $75 million federally funded program has raised concerns among LGBTQ+ advocates who fear that it may be censored or altered to reflect conservative values. Advocates argue that the audit is politically motivated and undermines inclusive, medically accurate sex education that serves vulnerable youth. Sex education in America has always reflected the broader cultural climate. Like many social issues, progress swings like a pendulum. It moves forward as marginalized groups gain rights, and swings back when that progress threatens the status quo. For over a century, sex education has moved with that pendulum, being reshaped again and again in response to changing norms around gender, sexuality, and relationships. But too often, it's been treated as a reaction to fear, offering quick fixes to perceived problems that weren't problems at all, but just signs of a society evolving. Instead of fear, sex ed should offer understanding. At its best, it challenges harmful stereotypes, it breaks down shame, and it teaches us to care for ourselves and for the people around us. One of the clearest and most compelling reasons to support comprehensive sex education is its role in preventing child abuse. When young people are taught about consent, bodily autonomy, and healthy boundaries, they're better equipped to speak up and recognize inappropriate behavior when it happens. I've heard way too many stories of people who did not realize they were being abused until after they took a sex ed class. We've seen what works. It's evidence-based, medically accurate programs that include not just sex and STI prevention, but also education on healthy relationships, on sexual orientation and gender identity, and abuse prevention. And we've seen all this lead to better outcomes for students. Sex education may not have been designed to spark social change, but if we let it, it absolutely could. It could help cultivate a culture where every person, regardless of where they come from, has the knowledge, support, and freedom to define their own future with safety, dignity, and autonomy. Only 26 states require sex education to be medically accurate. What the fuck? As the information would actually increase, specifically focused. In 1988, the ACL, although a lower court,